Everybody for coming today. And said I'm Bob Surridge, and this is Jake Grossman. Jake is the Educator and Collections Coordinator at the Old Baldy Foundation. In addition, he's an expert on spiders and alligators. A lot of eyes.
Sticking away from them.
Jake has a undergraduate degree in history and a master's degree in public history, both from Temple University. I didn't know Temple. I'm sorry. I'm a Penn Stater, so.
Beat you in football once. one time in 40 years when you were in football, and I was at that game.
Were you really?
Yeah, I still got the ticket.
Yeah, well, we're done today. All right, interesting. I thought the topic of your master's thesis was interesting. African descent to the British during the American Revolution. In one word, how did that go for the? How did that work out?
Mixed. But still, any chance of freedom, freedom with the British versus enslavement by the Americans. Gotta choose freedom, right? Isn't that what the American Revolution is kind of all about? Pursuing freedom at all costs. So it's just slightly ironic, it's with the other side.
So you do that presentation as well? That's in your...
I could, oh yeah. And down here, I mean, down Lower Cape Fear region experienced hundreds, if not thousands of people who fled enslavement by the Howells.
Interested in that?
Yeah.
African American?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Sure. Okay, and so today we're going to talk about female lighthouse keepers. What did you say in here? The women who picked up the wick when the men went down. I'll let you explain that.
Right. Well, thank you for the introduction. Let's go Owls, go Temple University, although right now the state of sports for Temple University is, I heard the word dismal earlier to describe a swamp. Well, we could say dismal Temple University athletics, to say the very least, right? As you found out, my name's Jake Grossman, Jacob Grossman, either one is fine. Educator Collections Coordinator at the Old Baldy Foundation on the other side of the Cape Fear River Inlet over here. As we also talked about, Temple University undergraduate degree, master's degree. I've done quite a few different things with the public history degree. Even public historians don't really know exactly what public history is. The way I describe it is kind of history outside of like the general academia. So presentations like this, working at historic sites, working at museums. I always have trouble pronouncing that word. I swear I talk for a living, yet I still can't talk. But working at archives, public sites like that is kind of what we do. So for me, I was an intern at Carpenter's Hall, which is a building in historic Philadelphia where they where they had the first Continental Congress before they signed the Declaration of Independence. I was at the Museum of the American Revolution too, so leading anywhere from 5th graders to 8th graders to senior groups around those winding galleries over there. Double-decker tour bus in Philly as well, so I was on top of one of those tour buses, which honestly is one of my favorite jobs. It was a lot of fun, but low-hanging trees, low-hanging signs, like they'll get you. If you're not paying attention, you're not ducking, you'll come out of there scathed by trees and stuff like that. But I did enjoy that one because I was outside, right? I really enjoyed being outside and kind of moving around the city, which is when I saw a job pop up down here where not only do I work in the museum, I am the collections coordinator, and we have a warehouse full of all these different objects over on Bald Head, including we're going to see one in a second, an 1872 handmade Fresnel lens. We'll talk about that. But we've got a warehouse full of stuff that just needs a new home, and so I'm able to care for that, as well as I was discussing earlier, drive people around on an 8-person golf cart, enjoying the weather and enjoying the history, or at least hopefully enjoying that history. Otherwise, been down here for a bit more than a year, thoroughly enjoying my time so far. This is going to go for about 30-ish, a little bit more minutes than that. Bathrooms are back out that door, out down to the right. Feel free to jump out there and go back and forth. I will not be offended. I will not mind interruptions. I mean, we're in the middle of school field trip season, so we're bringing over 100 4th graders on and off that ferry, up and down that Lighthouse every Wednesday or Thursday, so I will not be offended by any interruptions at all. Otherwise, everyone, I think we'll have time for questions. I'm sure we'll have time for questions, afterwards. I used to encourage people to ask questions as we go around, and I quickly learned that that was just not the most tenable way to do these presentations. But nonetheless, if there's time for questions afterwards, please feel free to ask away, and I'll try my humanly hardest to answer those questions, although if I do not have the answer, I will tell you. Not quite sure about that one. I'll get your email, and I'll try and hit you with an email, convince you to come to my next presentation. However, hopefully I'll have a better answer for you that time. On that note, I think that we're ready to get started here on a personal favorite presentation of mine, female or woman lighthouse keepers. And every time I've done this, I have not had a PowerPoint available. So I'm pretty excited to have some imagery here to work with and be able to point out some things. So I'm probably going to be bouncing all over the place, as I usually do when it comes to these presentations. But before we start talking about individual lighthouse keepers, let's just talk a little bit about what it was to be a lighthouse keeper. I promised you a picture of that first order Fresnel lens. That's it right there. That's actually it imaged at the Centennial Celebration in Philadelphia. So that's just one of the things that we have. And you can't really tell the size of that thing. It's about 8 feet wide, 8 feet tall too. And that's not even including the pedestal or the carriage that we kind of sit on as well. But anyway, so tending a light, being a lighthouse keeper, well, first things first is the light. Now, going back to ancient times, lighthouses were just an open flame on top of a building. Always capable of guiding ships and mariners into a harbor. Not really good at keeping you away from stuff, though. Up until the Fresnel lens was invented, mariners said you're more likely to run aground looking for a lighthouse than actually benefiting from said lighthouse, right? Fast forward up into the 1700s, they no longer just have an open flame, now they've got candles, right? Now they're working with candles, which is why I always say picking up the wick, working with that candle, right? Late 1700s, they progressed past candles. Now they have oil lamps, and they're also going to use some type of reflecting apparatus to reflect that light out there, whether it be like a mirrored metal sheet, or by the end of the 1700s, they're using parabolic reflectors. I'm not quizzing us on any of this stuff here. Parabolic reflectors, which almost picture like a cup on its side, and you're going to have a lamp or a light inside of that, and all of the inside of that cup-like shape is mirrored metal. So again, it's just trying to reflect as much of that light out as it possibly can. And it wasn't just one lamp in there. Sometimes they'd have 10 lamps and even more lamps than that. Each one of those lamps is going to need oil to stay alight, right? Which sometimes could be 4 gallons of oil per single lamp, where the whole entire kind of lighthouse has maybe 10 of them. Each one of them using all of that oil in one single night. That is a lot of oil, right? That is a lot of oil. You're going to have to carry that oil up and down. Obviously, well, you'll have a pulley system sometimes too. If you're working in the north, which isn't as much of a problem down here though, that oil may sometimes congeal and freeze. So you got to bring it back down, heat it back up, and then bring it back right on up. Well, 1817, that's when Old Baldy is first lit. That is also a really transitional period for lighthouse technology. So by the 1800s, let's grab England in 1812, over 300 different shipwrecks, just English ships in that 1 year. That was a lot of vessels that are going down. Who do we have to thank for kind of improving lighthouse technology? Napoleon. Of all people, Napoleon, we're in the middle of the Napoleonic era, the Napoleonic Wars, and he's trying to prove to the world, like, I'm not just a tyrant. Like, I am good for society. I'm going to better society. And you know what I'm going to do? I see all these mariners crashing shipwrecks. I'm going to improve lighthouse technology. So he sets all of these French physicists, kind of awards them, gives them a kind of like a competition to see who can kind of come up with a better idea for lighthouse technology. And that is when Augustin Jean Fresnel, and I apologize to any French speakers, as I'm sure I butchered that pronunciation, he comes up with the idea to use refraction, not reflection. So picture the Fresnel lens right over here. Each one of those individual glass prisms, which are also handmade glass in the early 1800s. You can imagine how difficult that was, getting that pure glass to actually do what he wanted it to do. But basically what it's going to do is it's going to take the light, it's going to kind of combine it into a single beam and then shoot that thing out. So long story short, it's called refraction. And a first order Fresnel lens, like this one you can see on the screen, was visible from 20 miles away, and it also used about half of the amount of oil as the strongest reflecting apparatuses did at that single time. It is the invention that saves 1 million ships. The lens though, it's kind of got a pulse, right? Like the Oak Island lens, you can see it gives a pulse, like a distinct thing so you know which one that is. Fresnel in 1820 says, these things are extremely heavy, a ton, they literally weigh a ton, and getting it to rotate around uniformly like clockwork was a little bit difficult. So he's the one who said in 1820, although it wasn't incorporated until 1890, that we should float these things in mercury, which is what this one ends up doing. It's a mercury float that was at the Cape Fear Light Station. But I digress. But I bring up that story simply to tell you that there's more than just lighting a light up there. Right? There's a lot of clockwork, a lot of machinery that goes in to keeping these lights actually doing what they want them to actually do. While I talk a little bit more about machinery, if it's so foggy out you can't see the lighthouse, you're going to use your ears, right? So a lot of these lighthouses would have fog bells, where there's some mechanisms surrounding them too as well, because they got to ring at a certain pace or a certain beat to let you know which lighthouse it actually is. Finally, the oil that they're using early on is whale spermicidal oil, which is not smokeless, odorless oil, to say the very least. It is extremely dirty oil. It's going to leave soot, it's going to leave grime absolutely all over the place. So when the lighthouse is not lit during the day, when you think the lighthouse keeper is sleeping, they're spending a lot of their time cleaning. They got to clean each one of those different prisms in there, right? They've got to clean the windows. If your windows are so dirty and covered in grime you can't see out of them, then what's the point of having your lighthouse even lit, right? So you got to clean your windows, and even before then you're going to have to clean all the reflecting apparatuses as well. Lots of different tools and things that goes towards, which I don't know if anyone has hawk-like vision, you can kind of see that these are different tools used by, or implements used by lighthouse keepers. And then finally, also, I mentioned I see a house up here. Now the government provided the house. The government provides the house, the government provides the supplies. If the lighthouse inspector shows up and your house is out of order, they can fire you. Because that is government property that you're not taking care of. So keeping up your house, literally just cleaning your house and making sure that it's in pristine condition at all times, is going to be another job of your lighthouse keeper that you might not think about. And then lastly, and I've said that multiple times already, but lastly, family. That's a big one here because a lot of women, a lot of female lighthouse keepers, they were kind of thrown into the role after the death or the serious injury of a father or of a husband or anything, or maybe even a son in some instances. Well, not only are they thrusted into this new role of being a lighthouse keeper, they still have a family to take care of, right? They're still mourning the loss of their husband. They're still taking care of someone who's severely injured from a ship's fall or something like that. So just a whole entire new element towards being a lighthouse keeper that we may not have thought of. Speaking of lighthouse keepers, it was not officially recorded before 1828. So think about all the different names of lighthouse keepers that are lost to record that we're not totally sure about, right? Up until 1939, it was actually a civilian job, which means you see a real mixed bag of different people who were lighthouse keepers. 1939 was when the Coast Guard took over being that lighthouse keeper. 1852, you can see the lighthouse establishment is first formed. Stephen Pleasanton is a superintendent of kind of lighthouses for about 30, 40 years during the 1800s. He was an absolute miser. He was not known for spending money, to say the very least. In fact, he bragged that he often gave money back to the government that was allocated for these lighthouses, which, for resisting Fresnel lenses and resisting to improve technology was not very good for mariners. But he is important for history because he kind of encouraged widows to pick up the wick after their husbands died. And this is kind of just me, but the fact that he was paying the woman less than he was paying the male counterparts, I think kind of might suggest a little bit why he was willing to do just that. Because we're going to see early on before Pleasanton, who he came in around 1820, early on you're going to see that some women were actually denied the role of being that lighthouse keeper because simply they were women. But I mentioned 1828, not officially recorded, but we do know a couple of the different women who did keep lights before them, starting with, of course, Hannah Thomas. She is our first ever woman lighthouse keeper that we know about here. 1776 to 1786, Gurnett Point. You can see it's a twin lighthouse. It's the first ever twin lighthouse, which means you got double the duty, right? Which is pretty brutal. Just outside of Boston is Gurnett Point. Her husband, John Thomas, he was a soldier. He was a soldier before he became a lighthouse keeper. So in 1776, when the American Revolutionary War begins, he goes off to fight in it, goes up to Canada for a very, very poor, failed invasion of Canada that we did early on in that war, gets smallpox, dies. So who's going to keep that light while he's gone? His wife, Hannah Thomas. And if you can see in this bottom image here, you know, lighthouses obviously are extremely important for maritime trade. And that is a huge part of the of the colonial history here in the United States. So the British are going to see that the American and the Patriots are using these lighthouses for navigation. They're not going to allow them to do that, right? They're going to try and take these lighthouses down. So the Continental Army actually had to build a fortification. You can see it around. This is a modern day picture. They had to build a fortification around that lighthouse. Well, so not only did Hannah Thomas keep the light for the entire duration of the war and then a couple years afterwards, she did it in the middle of, quite literally in the middle of a war zone. The British multiple times try and take down that lighthouse. In fact, after the war, she petitions the government for compensation for money that was used to the lighthouses which suffered damage after the British bombarded it. After the war, she does want to be the lighthouse keeper. She's not necessarily denied the role, but she figures out that's not going to happen. But she does get her son to pick up that wick and be the official lighthouse keeper afterwards in 1790. And you can see, this is from the official record, whose mother has had the care of the lighthouse of Plymouth, right? Mother care of the lighthouse of Plymouth. And I failed to mention earlier how this presentation goes, basically a profiling of a couple of different woman lighthouse keepers over time, right? Moving on to our next one, who is also kind of not an unofficial lighthouse keeper, not quite official, but it's one that's a lot more local to our story here, a lot more local to Bald Head Island in the lower Cape Fear region, and it is, of course, Rebecca Long. Now, what we're looking at here, this is an oil image, or ink and oil image of the first ever lighthouse in North Carolina. This is on Bald Head, or used to be on Bald Head Island. This image, which we actually have this in our collections, I've held up the image, it's pretty cool. We actually have this in, not on display right now though. But anyway, so this is the only known depiction of said lighthouse. It was commissioned by George Washington in 1795. Money for it was allocated by Alexander Hamilton, right? What we're looking at here is actually a water sprout. So you can see water shooting up. Those are clouds. And then on the right side is actually Oak Island. So on the left side there is Bald Head Island. So you're kind of looking out, right? You're kind of looking out from almost the point of view that we have from over here, right? But anyways, this is the only known depiction here of this lighthouse. It's the first lighthouse in North Carolina. Didn't necessarily know exactly where to put a lighthouse early on in North Carolina history, right? And like me, a lot of this lighthouse was actually constructed in Philadelphia and sent down here to North Carolina. Unlike me, I imagine that was a lot more difficult in 1795 than it was in 2000 whenever I drove down I-95 just to get here, right? But nonetheless, they're trying to figure out a spot where to put this lighthouse. They figure out, you know what? Let's just put it down right where the ocean meets the river. Can't miss it, right? Absolutely can't miss that thing. It's right there on the beach, easy peasy. Not a very good long-term plan, right? After 10, 15 years, they realized it was built on extremely unstable ground, that lighthouse is going to come down, and the national government said, North Carolinians, we are not going to fund an entire another lighthouse ship down here from Philadelphia for you. Figure it out. So what they do is they actually take that down, and they reuse thousands of the bricks as well as the metal lantern room for the construction of Old Baldy, right? For the construction of Old Baldy. This image here on the left, this is where the lighthouse, this is as close as you can be to where it would have used to be. Where we think it used to be is totally underneath water. It's like smack dab in the middle of that river inlet. This is called the groin there on Bald Head Island. Enough about that lighthouse though. Let's talk about the first ever lighthouse keeper. There's a fellow by the name of Henry Long, who lasted a decent amount of time as a lighthouse keeper. One could say a long time. I'm sorry, everyone. Before he's actually shot and killed in a hunting accident over there on Bald Head Island. I know what you're thinking, like, who was even living on this island in 1805? Who was even there hunting? Well, not a lot of people. So Henry Long lived there, right, as the official lighthouse keeper. His wife, Rebecca Long, lived there as well, helping him keep that light. They did have at least one enslaved person, we believe one indentured servant. Also living there were 3 different grandchildren, and then their son-in-law, Joseph Swain, who only moved in recently with the grandchildren after his wife, their daughter, passed away, leaving him to raise the kids. He says, I can't do this alone. So he moves on to Bald Head Island. He goes out hunting around noon. Unbeknownst to him, his father-in-law is already out hunting. He hears rustling in the bushes, points his musket, bam! There goes Henry Long, shot and killed, hunting accident on Bald Head Island in 1805, right? In 1805. Well, records suggest that they were pretty friendly with each other. I know what everyone's thinking, like, your son-in-law shoots the father-in-law and isolated out in a hunting accident. We'll never be certainly sure, but we're pretty sure that they were friendly. Records suggest they were friendly, and it really was just a freak accident. But we are sure about, for 3 months after Henry Long is dead, the lighthouse continues to be lit. Now, I think we can easily guess who's the one who is doing the lighting of that lighthouse, considering the theme of this presentation, right? Rebecca Long. She picks up that wick after Henry Long is dead and keeps that light. She'd probably already been keeping it before. Lighthouse keepers historically never paid a lot of money. The government figured we're giving you supplies, we're giving you a house, like you're gonna get paid a lot too, like come on. So often they would need to have a second or third job. Henry Long was a fisherman as well as a river pilot here in the Lower Cape Fear region. So Rebecca Long was doing it for 3 months when she hears that Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States at the time, has put out a call for a new lighthouse keeper on Bald Head Island. She's a little peeved by that. She said, I've been doing it for 3 months, nobody's complained. I'm probably the only person relatively familiar with living on that island. Up to then, nobody had really lived on Bald Head Island, maybe fished off of Bald Head Island, but really nobody's lived on it. So she goes to Wilmington and she writes a letter to Timothy Bloodworth, who does an ex-gunsmith turned into the collector of customs in Wilmington. And she says, I've heard that Thomas Jefferson was looking for a new lighthouse keeper. It should be me. Timothy Bloodworth says, not a bad idea. I don't have the authority to do that, though, right? So then he writes a letter to Albert Gallatin, who was the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, and tell him, hey, we actually have someone who could fill in for the lighthouse keeper on Bald Head Island. She's well respected, and in fact, she was included on the list of official mourners for George Washington when he died in 1799. Each town, kind of city, had like an official list of it. We don't know exactly what it takes to get on that list. Kind of just well-known, well-respected people. Very few women on that list, though, from Wilmington. Rebecca Long was one of them. So Albert Gallatin hears this. He says, yes, it's fine by me, but I too do not have the authority to do this, right? So he goes to Thomas Jefferson and says, Mr. President, how do you feel about having a woman down south in North Carolina, Rebecca Long, be the lighthouse keeper on Bald Head Island? Just so you know, this will be the first ever woman in a governmental role in the entire history of the United States. Thomas Jefferson's response, and you can see the letter survives right up there. I know it's pretty hard to decipher 18th century writing, particularly when you're sitting far away, but let me just sum up the important part of it. He responds, that is an innovation for which the public is not ready, nor am I. Denies Rebecca Long her official role there of being a Bald Head Island official lighthouse keeper. Nonetheless, she is very ingrained in the history, not here just of Bald Head Island, not just the history of female lighthouse keepers. She is one of the first ever, any male or woman, whatever, lighthouse keeper here in North Carolina, albeit unofficially, right? She moves actually over here to Southport, and she has to watch that lighthouse get lit until she dies, watching Cedric Springs, who closes down the original lighthouse, and then he's going to be the one that opens up Old Baldy in 1817. And I won't move off the slide without mentioning there's a really unique moment where she's robbed by that indentured servant I mentioned and that enslaved woman, rob her for like $300 or some dollars, or pounds maybe, in the early 1800s, which is a ton of money. We know about that because she leaves a newspaper article asking for information about it. And then finally, I also mentioned after Henry Long dies, she is the executor of his account, his estate too, which I imagine was not too common for women. Women often outlived men back then, so maybe it's a little bit less common than not. But nonetheless, we'll continue on talking about Kate Moore here. She, as you can see, she had 8 oil lamps. Each one needs 4 gallons in a night, which means she's going to be kind of going up and down those steps multiple times. As you can see, Connecticut, which means it might be freezing or congealing, like as I mentioned earlier. She not only kept that light, but she also saved at least 21 different people from drowning. We're going to see that's a common theme. Not only do these women keep those lights, but quite often they saved a couple different people from drowning in those local harbors. She took over when she was 12 years old. Is when she first starts keeping that light. So her father was some kind of a sailor who gets injured in a fall on a ship. So the kind of government, or I think he was in the Navy, basically said like, we'll give you a cushy job, like we'll make you a lighthouse keeper. Well, quickly realizes that he wasn't able to do that. That's when she first starts helping him when she's 12 years old, which basically also shows that not only is she helping take care of that father, but she's also keeping this light as well. And she writes, and I got quite a few quotes here for our presentation, because I like to let people speak for themselves as much as I possibly can, right? Well, she described her childhood. She said, "I never had much of a childhood. That is, I never knew playmates. Mine were the chickens, the ducks, and lambs, and our 2 Newfoundland dogs, right?" And also she mentioned that one of her biggest regrets, or one of her worst memories, was how many dead bodies washed up onto the shore too. When they asked her about that, she said, "That's my biggest thing, is not being able to save everyone." And that hundreds of dead bodies washed up, and that she had to care for them until the government came to pick them up. Meanwhile, going through quite a few other things as well. Moving on to Abby Burgess Grant, who was a lighthouse keeper in Maine from 1853 to 1892. I really, really enjoyed, this is a screenshot by yours truly here on Google Maps, just to show you how far away from the mainland that actually lighthouse was. 20 miles off the coast of Maine is where she was keeping that light, which is an absolutely, bonkers place to be watching storms and seeing storms. You're so exposed to the element. Again, I'm going to use her words for it to describe the second point here during the bad storm where she watched the old cottage get knocked over. She said, and this is her writing to her friend, and her friend is talking about how majestic her life must be and how nice it must be. And this is her response to her friend about what it was like. She says, "Early in the day, as the tide rose, the sea made a complete breach of rock, washing everything movable away, and of the whole old cottage, not one stone remained." She was there not by herself. She's actually caring for her younger sister as well as her mom. So her dad was the lighthouse keeper, but he was gone. So he had to go to Maine to actually get supplies. And by the time he was ready to get back to the lighthouse, couldn't get back there, right? The storm picked up too much. It takes him a month to get back to the lighthouse with those said supplies. But she also goes on to say that it was almost so much adrenaline going on keeping that light during that time. She never thought about not keeping the light. She never thought about not actually doing her job. She moves out of not only the old cottage to the new cottage. From the new cottage is where she watches the old cottage get washed away. It is about that moment she realizes, like, maybe this is not safe either. So she takes her elderly mom as well as her younger sister, and they go into the lighthouse and realize that the lighthouse is probably the only thing that's going to survive that storm. From the lighthouse, she looks out and she sees a coop of hens. And she says the hens were our only companions. And she asked her mom, like, should I go save those hens? Her mom was like, "No, just leave the hens. Like, it's okay, we'll survive." Well, she wasn't going to do that. So she says she grabbed, seizing a basket, "I ran out a few yards after the rollers had passed. With the water knee-deep, I rescued all but one." All but one hen is rescued by Abby Burgess Grant. She ends up marrying the replacement, so eventually her father is replaced. So she was always assistant, I guess, if you will, keeper, right? Eventually her father is replaced by Isaac Grant. She gets along pretty well with Isaac Grant. In fact, she marries him. And then they go to keep a different light in Maine to finish out her life. And sorry, I have one more quote here. No, sorry, I got messed up. I do have one more quote here for her. Right, excellent. So towards the end of her life, when she's nearing retirement, nearing passing away, she said, "If ever I have a gravestone, I would like it to be a lighthouse or a beacon." Because we're going to find out that a lot of these lighthouse keepers, female lighthouse keepers, well, quite literally, keeping the light was the 24/7 job, right? So it really becomes a huge part of their lives. Moving on to perhaps the most famous woman lighthouse keeper, definitely the most famous lighthouse keeper, come on, Jake. The most famous lighthouse keeper in the history of the United States is a woman by the name of Ida Lewis. Her father suffers a pretty debilitating stroke when she's 15 years old, which is when she takes over that light. Rhode Island, Lime Rock, Rhode Island, so pretty far north of Rhode Island is where she is. You can see her in a couple of these pictures on this little raft. She would raft her siblings, her younger siblings, to and from the mainland to take them to school. She would also use that raft to save a lot of people. She was known as being the best swimmer in all of Rhode Island, and also for saving people's lives. And after she conducted one rescue mission where she saved a couple people from drowning, afterwards a reporter or someone said, like, "Don't you think it's unfeminine to row a boat?" And she responded, "None but a donkey would consider it unfeminine to save a life." So she's a pretty amazing woman. Anywhere for her most famous celebrity, her most famous life-saving mission was actually towards the end of her career. The harbor kind of froze over in the middle of the winter, so she heard all this screaming and looked outside and sees holes in the ice and things like, oh man, someone must have fallen right through there, right? So she runs out there with her oar. And she drags out this big burly soldier who's trying to cross over the frozen harbor. By then, her younger brother had heard everyone screaming. He runs out there. Together, they realize there's a second person in there. They pull out the second person. Everyone takes a deep breath, like, whew, and then they look at Ida, who's not a very big woman, and say, Ida, how did you get that first guy out of there? She responds, I do not know. I ain't very strong. When I need the strength, I ask Almighty, and sometimes they give it to me, right? Sometimes they give it to me with enough strength, enough adrenaline that day to save not one, but both of those soldiers from falling through that ice. Afterwards, she became even more of a celebrity than she was. She was known as not only being the most popular female White House keeper, but just the most popular White House keeper in general in the United States at that time. She's visited by Ulysses S. Grant, who was the president of the United States at that time, and supposedly when Grant gets off his raft to see her, he gets his feet wet. And there's a reporter there, I was like, Mr. President, you got your feet wet? He said, to visit Ida Lewis, I would have gotten soaking wet up to the armpits. Up to the armpits, right? So she's really cool, really fascinating woman. At one point, she's given the gold medal for the United States Life-Saving Services. This historian is pretty sure she's the only woman to ever receive that gold medal. They did not give those things out very lightly. But moving on, Harriet Colfax, so Michigan City, so on Lake Michigan. The main kind of image I like to focus on here is this middle one there, because her light was kind of a beacon. It was at the end of that pier. Well, how does it look to be crossing that pier in the middle of a storm, right? We're pretty sure that she was wearing, so sometimes women White House keepers will wear boy suits, but we're pretty sure that she was wearing a dress when she would have to cross that thing, which I cannot imagine just the freezing cold weather and the fear of just being washed right over and then you're done. I am an ignorant person down here because I did not know Lake Michigan has so many lighthouses, but she was right there on Lake Michigan, and just how intense that weather got. You can see she kept a really cool diary, and she wrote down the one day, waves dashing over both piers, very nearly carrying me with them into the lake. Her husband passes away, and then she actually finds a local woman. Together they become quite friendly, move in together, actually live together for quite a while. To a lot of speculation, perhaps maybe the only known woman lesbian White House keeper that we know about. We're not 100% sure, right? But you can see a newspaper listing after her roommate, let's say, passes away. Harriet dies quickly after that one too, and you can see kind of make out deprived of her reason to live, right? Deprived of her reason to live. Moving on here, Elizabeth Williams. So Elizabeth Williams also had a husband who was a White House keeper. She was Beaver Island, Little Traverse, Michigan, 1872 to 1913. So her husband is the White House keeper first, and he sees a ship floundering, and he goes out there to save everyone, as one would hope. He ends up drowning. He ends up failing to save them. He ends up drowning. So afterwards, she takes up the light, and she was spending. People ask her, like, Elizabeth Williams, like, you must be sad keeping that light of the same White House that your husband used to work at, right? And she responded, though the light dearest to me had gone out, yet there were others out there in the dark and treacherous waters who needed the rays from the shining light of my tower. So she picked up that light and kept it going. You can see the quote on that I actually included up there too, is eventually she ends up marrying someone, and when she goes to marry this person, they say, well, as a single woman, as a widow, we could see you being able to do it at the time. But with a husband, you think you'll still be able to do it? And she said, I keep the best light on the lakes, right? Which I thought was a pretty cool brag by her here. Kind of moving a little bit further away to our final, if you believe it or not, our final woman that I'm going to profile here, which is Fanny Salter. And she was the last ever civilian woman White House keeper, right? She continues it, I believe, yes, that she continues it after the Coast Guard takes it over, but she was kind of grandfathered, or I guess grandmothered, in at this particular point, right? So she was able to keep it up until her retirement in 1947. Cool enough, she was the 4th woman to keep Turkey Point's light, so I guess it was just a chain of women who kept on doing that. Also, for the most part, this is a little bit more on the West Coast, but it certainly happened East Coast pretty often too, when that fog rolls in. Well, we know that the fog rolled in for sure down here, right? When that fog rolls in, again, you're gonna have to use the fog horns and the fog bells, right? Well, one time she sees a ship coming in, going up to Philly, but there comes the fog, so she can only hear it, so she runs into her White House and she starts the mechanism for ringing that fog bell, which is a distinct beat to let you know particularly exactly which White House it is. Well, the moment she starts ringing that thing, she can hear the cord snap. So then she realizes she's got to manually ring it. Every 15 seconds, boom, boom. Keeps it up for over an hour until she can no longer hear that ship going by here, right? Which I can't even imagine how the strength of that right arm, or lefty, she could have been a lefty too, to do at that time. You see that other spots too, where they keep it up for hours, often doing it to manually ring that thing. It seems like when you need your technology and mechanisms to work the best, that's when they kind of fail on you. Right? But she was the last ever one. She was appointed by Calvin Coolidge, President Coolidge, to be the White House keeper. And towards her retirement, she, like many of the women White House keepers, described, as I alluded to earlier, how much of their life is that White House. And afterwards, after she retired, she said, "Maybe I couldn't sleep away from the light. You see, its bright beam had been shining through my bedroom window for so many years. Its presence would become my security and my companion," right? My security and my companion. Well, White House keepers nowadays is, for the most part, it's an extinct occupation. 99.9% of White Houses are indeed automated, such as Oak Island White House over there, which is automated, just kind of flipping a switch and letting it go, right? But nonetheless, although there might not be an actual human being up there keeping that light, not only are male White House keepers, but female White House keepers intertwined with the history here of the United States. So whenever we see that Oak Island light, whenever we see one of the container ships, cargo ships rolling through that aren't necessarily relying on that light, but one's got to imagine that that's got to be, which are a comforting presence to see a White House and realize, like, oh, wait, there's mainland. After it takes you sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, about 2 weeks to get one of those container ships abroad, give or take, right? Let us think about all the different White House keepers, male and woman, who allowed those White Houses to take off and to allow the United States to grow to what we've became today. Speaking of today, everyone, I would just like to give a special thanks to Mary Clifford and J. Candace Clifford. They are the authors of Woman Who Kept the Lights, which is a lot of this presentation was based off of their fascinating book, which if you haven't read, these are just a couple of the women that they talk about in there. So if you haven't read that, definitely go check that out, and then enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you so much. And of course, if we have any questions, please. Yeah.
Sure. It's kind of three phases, if you will. One, talk to me about something like the frying pan light ship, and then talk to me about Price's Creek, which was a range light, I believe. Mm-hmm. And was there ever a time when all three of them were lit?
So all three of them being the light ship, Price's Creek, or both the Price's Creek ones, or? So the frying pan light ship is one I'll start out with too. That, I just can't even imagine that posting. So that is the frying pan light ship. For those who don't know, it's a lighthouse on a ship, right? Which I didn't know that those things existed until I came down here. But that ship was moored 30 miles out off the tip of the frying pan shoals. And mariners who worked aboard that thing described it as being the most boring job of all time until it was the most terrifying job of all time. Because again, when you need lighthouses the most is inclement weather. So for hurricanes and stuff, they would have been posted all the way out there. The light ship, though, never really was that amazing of a light. Not as bad as Old Baldy. Old Baldy was complained about throughout its entire existence of being very poor. Because Old Baldy, they made the mistake for the first time building it too close. For Old Baldy, they built it too far inland, right? So it was too far inland, it wasn't tall enough, it wasn't bright enough. But the lightship was out there from the 1850s until I think the 1940s. The lightship was out there when they replaced it with what is still out there, the Frying Pan Tower, a repurposed oil rig that is still out. No longer an official guide to navigation, but it is very much still out there. So from 1850 to 1940s, it would in. Price's Creek was first lit. Maybe help me with this. Is 1840 was Price's Creek right around then, I believe.
Before the Civil War?
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. I also think the lightship was out there until the early 60s.
Oh, early 60s, okay, yeah, thank you. I was gonna say, I knew it was began in 1850, so it came like 100 years out there. More than a decade.
Did the lightship go to Philadelphia, or I thought it went somewhere in
Manhattan.
Manhattan, yeah.
Now in Manhattan, it's on the National Register of Historic Places as a part of a restaurant.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's the Frying Pan Restaurant.
It's a bar on the water.
Yeah, it is, yeah. So I actually had some guests on my tour over on Baldhead 2 weeks ago from Manhattan. And I showed them the picture of it, and they all just started dying laughing. Like, oh, we literally just had drinks there 2 nights ago on the Frying Pan Lightship. Talk about an origin story. Because I think at one point it sinks in the Cape Fear River, too. They take it in, it sinks, they pull it back out. And then they sell it to that restaurateur over there. Now, the Price's Creek ones would have been 2 lighthouses, 2 beacons, if you will. And basically what you did, and I hope this is answering your question, not repeating knowledge you already know, is when you're sailing into the Cape Fear River, you're going to line them up together, and then you're going to know the proper direction to go into that river. Keeping one of them would have been just like keeping another lighthouse, right? Probably would have been a little bit less steps. The Price Creek one is only, what, 20 feet tall? But nonetheless, they would have been in use at the same time as the Frying Pan one, and the same time as Old Baldy. Old Baldy was decommissioned not until 1930, although there are a handful of years where it is decommissioned and then brought back and then decommissioned again. So I hope that answers some.
So at one time, there were 3 of them were in operation simultaneously.
Yeah, definitely. And then almost even, so the Cape Fear Light Station is 1903, but by then Price Creek is probably done, I imagine.
I don't think Price Creek was started after the Civil War.
Yeah, as I say, I don't think it came back after the Civil War. But then you would have had the Cape Fear Light Station, the Frying Pan Lightship, and Old Baldy would have been official guides to navigation at once.
But obviously you couldn't see all 3 of them at the same time.
Yeah.
You said you could see all.
Could not.
No, you could not. No, you could not.
Because of the lightship.
Right, just the physical, yeah, well, Horizon too, I would think that, you know.
Yeah.
Oak Island had the second most powerful light in the world at in 58 or something like that when they opened?
It's still the second most powerful in the United States right now, too. Oak Island, yeah. One of the newest ones as well. I think it's the second newest one constructed in the United States, is Oak Island.
Yeah, that sounds right, but I don't know.
I think so. I mean, the 50s, I think, was put in.
1958, yeah, 1958 is supposed to put in. And one of my favorite fun facts about the Oak Island Lighthouse is that we've all seen images, look, I can point to the different ones that are around us, of like Hatteras and Body and Lookout. They all have those distinct day marks painted onto them, patterns that you know like which particular one that is. Well, those older lighthouses are brick and those stones, so they got to repaint those things over and over again. Oak Island, they're using concrete, and they're tired of charging taxpayers money to repaint them. So they figure, you know what, let's just dump the paint into the concrete and see if it works. It's 1958, which means what kind of paint are they using?
Lead-based.
All lead-based paint. If you're under the age of 7, they do not let you climb Oak Island because of all that lead-based paint. If you're older than that, go ahead. But if you're under the age of 7, yeah, it's all lead-based paint, yeah.
Yeah, one other one. How do they come up with the signature that lighthouse is going to have as opposed to, 4 on, 6 off, or whatever?
So that is, honestly, I'm not sure. I think it's just kind of, I don't want to say a numbers game, but trying to figure out which one is available at that time. I will mention that, so when you had sail-powered ships, you could have a pretty slow pulse going, right? Because it's going to take them a while to go by there and see the different beats. But with the invention of steam-powered ships, they realized those ships are now going 15 some knots, maybe faster than that. They need to have a faster beat in order for that mariner to actually see it. That's when they go back to Fresnel's notes and they find the mercury floats. So although Fresnel first talks about it in 1820, he dies pretty shortly after that. I think he's dead by the time 1830, Fresnel is already gone. But the mercury floats that he said weren't put into use until 1890. And they were so good that even though that thing weighs an absolute ton, that Fresnel lens weighs an absolute ton, See if I can jump back to it. Even though that thing weighs a ton, it would spin for 4 minutes afterwards, after they turned off the mechanism. Because basically by dropping it in that mercury, it's totally frictionless. But how they actually came up with which one would get which one, it was a whole big plan. Because you can't just plan your lighthouse and then Sullivan's Island has the same exact one, right? That's not going to work. You need to be in conjunction with all of the states and all the different things.
Jake, who's standing in the doorway?
That is Sonny Dozier. Sonny Dozier, longtime lighthouse keeper for Old Baldy. That's Old Baldy photographed in the 1890s, I believe is when Old Baldy is. You can see it's painted all white. But my favorite thing is, if you look really closely, you see that little figure next to him? It's his daughter. It's his daughter, because it wasn't just a one person keeping those lights. It's always a family, right? It's always a family job. And then final thing I'll mention is, you see the railing on the top there? That's so you can get out after a bird goes crashing into your glass. You can get onto the outside and clean it off. Yeah.
So I have 2 questions. Ida Lewis, how far did she have to row back to the mainland when she took her?
So that is another good question. I'm not totally sure about that either. It wasn't the 20 miles like it was for Maine, but it was never that I can think of a point where she was like left alone, like she couldn't get supplies up there as much. But I'm not sure, maybe 10. And on 10 miles, 5 miles, around there. I'm not sure, but it was not easy. There's a reason why she became the best swimmer out there. But it was nothing like the Manicus light one. Yeah, it's definitely a lot closer than that.
And the second question, how do you feel lighthouses currently contribute to the safety of vessels out there with all the technology in maritime and sonar today?
I think, and I kind of alluded to, a great question. And remind me to jot down the first question, because that's the one that I should probably know the answer to. I think, honestly, one of the biggest impacts is like, look, the cargo ships, the container ships, they're not necessarily relying on those lighthouses anymore, right? The super yachts that you see, what do you call them, the snowbirds, right? Who take those super yachts from Florida to Cape Cod every spring and every fall. They're not as much relying on those lighthouses anymore. Older vessels, smaller vessels still very much are. But for me, relying on Oak Island for guidance into the Cape Fear. But for me, I think just for morale boost. I can't even imagine sailing across, being so far away from the mainland, you don't see anything. Back in the day, to cross Revolutionary War, it's going to take you 2 months. Fast forward about a month during the 1860s, now we're down to about 2 weeks. But I just can't even imagine the morale boost of seeing those lighthouses and realize there is a light out there guiding me into one place. And also, I was talking about this the other day, this is my Napoleon thing was kind of so funny because a lighthouse is built not necessarily just for one specific country. It's built for the world, right? There's no one who can ever say that a lighthouse is put somewhere to deter people, right? Or, well, I guess quite literally deter you away from shoals and things like that. But nobody can say it's not a benevolent, it's not a charitable thing to do for the whole entire world. That's for me, it's morale boost, I think. Although I have never sailed across the ocean, so I would like to see it myself for sure.
Jake,
Yeah.
Life-saving service, connection. I mean, you talk about the keepers, the lighthouse keepers, saving people repeatedly.
Yeah.
Is there any connection there with the life-saving service?
So, another great question. I mean, there's the connection, and I mentioned Ida Lewis, she was awarded the gold medal. That was by the United States Life-Saving Services. How often they did, so the USLSS was the precursor to the Coast Guard, basically. Oak Island had a station, Bald Head had a station that was built in the 1870s, and their job was exactly as it sounds, to go out there and save lives. So I know that they awarded her that one. I also know that we all know Captain Charles Norton Swan, right, from the Cape Fear Light Station. I know he worked a lot with the United States Life Saving Services station over there. He would often help them look out for ships, and then not radio down there. Maybe use signal flags to alert them down there where that ship might be. Otherwise, I mean, I think that's as close as the connection you got, just a relationship where they're almost always next to each other, right? Not always, but they're always, they're both on the coast kind of a thing, yeah. And the lakes too, the lakes have a life-saving station as well. Yeah.
Maybe explain a little bit about what a life-saving station is.
Well, yeah, so it is just, a station close to the coast where you're going to be looking out to see any kind of a shipwreck. Started around the 1870s, brought under the Coast Guard of 1920s, is right around over there. And basically they had two different ways of actually saving people's lives. Well, early on, two different ways of saving people's lives. The first one, and if I had my images to help us here, it'd probably make it a little more sense, but it's called a Lyle gun, which picture a cannon up to my knee, like a little bronze cannon. They're gonna use their bodies, they tether it to their bodies. Each station would have 7 actual surfmen, as well as 1 keeper. Keeper was the only one who was there year round. Only one who was there year round, only one who could move, the only one where the government paid for a family to be there too. But the 7 surfmen would only be there for hurricane season, right? So if you happen to be in hurricane season, which it wasn't always hurricane season when one of those ships went down, but if you happen to be there, those 8 men, they would run out there and the 7 surfmen would tether this little cannon, again, it's up to your knee, out onto the beach. And they're going to see a ship that's sinking from anything within 700 yards, right? And basically they're going to fire a projectile, not at it, we're not trying to sink the ship that's already sinking, right? They're going to fire a projectile over it. Because what that projectile is, picture like a missile with a hoop on the back of it, and then looped through that hoop is a rope, because that rope is connected to the ground, to the beach, with of course, sand anchor. It's quite literally what that thing was called, right? So the people aboard the vessel, they're going to grab that rope after it shoots over, and they're going to tether it to anything, the highest remaining thing on that vessel. They'll tether it to that. Meanwhile, everyone on the beach, all of our United States Life Saving Service members, are kind of using a pulley system attached to that rope to send out what is called breeches buoys, which is a life ring with pants sewed into it. So they use a pulley system to send that thing all the way out there. Once it's on the vessel, each individual sailor hops in, and then they ride it like a zip line, ding, to get back to the beach, ding, to get back to the beach, over and over and over again, which seems a little silly, but it was a very effective way of doing it. And the only other option is really just to pile a surfman into a surf boat and just start rowing. And that's what they had to do quite a few times. In fact, John Watts had a famous rescue mission here in the Lower Cape Fear in October 1896, where he had to row with his 7 surfmen 8 miles out in the middle of what we think was a Category 2 hurricane. 8 hours it took them to row. Got everyone, all 8 of them, off that board onto the surf boat. The way back was a little bit quicker, 4 hours to row back, right? So 12 hours of rowing to save those lives. And that's what they did, and not to go on too long, but I'm sure they thought about their motto, which is an old keeper was looking at a was looking at a shipwreck with a young surfman, and the young surfman's like, points at us, do you think we'll come back alive? And supposedly he takes out his manual, and he's scrolling around, he's looking around and everything, and he says, you know what, son? There's nothing in here that says we come back alive. All it says is we have to go out. That became their motto. You don't always come back in, but you always go out. And for extremely underpaid, underappreciated position, those men went out over and over and over again. Yeah. But yeah.
The lighthouse in the Outer Banks was moved a number of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered, because of sea level rise or other conditions,
Yeah.
whether that's a larger contemplation of moving other lighthouses to sustain their life.
Not to my knowledge. The moving of Hatteras Lighthouse, I can't even imagine how difficult that was. And they just put in these rollers and just rolled it back. But you can imagine the amount of money that would go into that. Now for Old Baldy, we're a private nonprofit. Hatteras is national, so they can kind of fund that one a little bit better. Old Baldy is pretty sturdy. I mean, it's 5 foot thick of brick, and it's been there for quite a while. I mean, Hurricane Hazel rolled through in the 1950s, decimated Ocean Isle and decimated Oak Island as well. Old Baldy withstood that. I'm not sure, honestly Bob might know too, but as far as I know, there are no current plans of moving any of the other ones back. That I'm trying to think of the other Outer Banks ones, but I don't think so. Currituck I think is pretty settled, I think Body's pretty settled. I'm not sure about Lookout. The Lookout is all the way out there. But no, that's a good question. It's a good question. Okay, thank you everyone.